Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really intense and honestly pretty dense sociological and legal critique drawn straight from our source material. We're going to take a completely impartial look at a highly controversial perspective on modern society, the justice system, and honestly, the very concept of human survival. The source lays out this massive argument that connects deeply personal, individual trauma to sweeping macro-level state policies. It's a fascinating, albeit very dark, look at how one person's extreme experience can completely reshape their worldview into a massive critique of systemic power. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for the argument. We'll be hitting 5 key areas: the modern outlaw, ecosystems of avoidance, the void of accountability, evaluating the MAID program, and finally, state-sanctioned erasure.
Starting off with Section 1, the modern outlaw. This is a case study of systemic alienation.
So what happens when the system itself constructs the outlaw? The source poses this provocative question right out of the gate, and it really sets the stage. This first section focuses entirely on the micro level, because this whole macro critique we're about to explore, it actually starts with a highly personal catalyst. We're looking at a case study of a man named Kyle McLean Smith. According to the speaker, his divorce proceedings weren't just a normal breakup. Instead, the source frames the entire legal separation as an intentional, systematic attack on the institution of monogamy itself. It's presented as a scenario where a person is actively targeted and dismantled by external actors operating within a network state.
To explain this situation, the source draws a really stark contrast. Historically, an outlaw was a rebel, right? Someone who actively broke the law. But the source defines the modern outlaw entirely differently. This is a citizen who hasn't broken the law at all, but who has been systematically denied access to justice. They've been completely locked out by the state, leaving them totally defenseless. The speaker even uses this striking pop culture imagery, describing himself as navigating a survivalist, almost political refugee type of existence. To truly understand how this alienation fuels the broader arguments, we really have to look at the raw emotion behind it all. In the text, the speaker states, "I don't know if Emily is still alive. I have already sacrificed the most critical thing in my entire existence." This intense, totally unfiltered grief over his wife is the absolute bedrock of this presentation. It completely grounds the enormous sociological critique we're about to dive into in this immense, very real personal sacrifice.
And to show just how complete the systemic lockout actually was, the source gives us a really stark metric: 200. After inexplicably losing his initial legal counsel, the speaker reached out to over 200 different lawyers over the course of several months. He was fully willing and able to pay, but he had absolutely zero success. 200 lawyers. No way. It's a number the source uses to perfectly illustrate what it actually means to exist entirely outside the system's protections.
Moving on to Section 2, ecosystems of avoidance, diagnosing human nature's blind spot.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how society reacts to this kind of profound, raw, individual trauma. The source shifts to what you might call the meso level and defines this concept of an ecosystem of avoidance. When we are confronted with the raw, intense delivery of someone else's pain, our brains instinctively try to protect themselves. Looking at it just hurts too much. The source argues that this perfectly natural human reflex inadvertently creates a toxic societal setup where deep, systemic pain is just constantly ignored. The speaker walks us through this rapid descent step by step. First, you have the confrontation with raw trauma, someone literally crying out for help. Second comes this involuntary psychological disengagement, where society actually struggles to witness the pain and just looks away. And third, because everyone is looking away, the underlying injustices are allowed to thrive completely unchecked. Personal pain just gets systematically buried by a society that refuses to witness it. Which brings us to Section 3, the void of accountability, when the system fails completely. This refusal to witness pain creates a really dangerous vacuum. We're now exploring what happens when vulnerable people seek help, specifically in environments built on trust, but find themselves trapped in an entirely unregulated environment. The source material unpacks this catastrophic failure of accountability, specifically pointing to exploitative healing, therapeutic, and guru communities. The speaker outlines 4 main pillars that allow this abuse to thrive. First, these communities operate with a total lack of institutional guardrails. Second, there is zero legal recourse for the victims. Third, they're supported by a complicit network of enablers who basically protect the abusers. And finally, the source claims that government and police institutions completely ignore the abuse, leaving victims stranded.
So,
The crucial point here is that in these spaces built purely on trust, the power imbalance is entirely weaponized. The victim is left completely isolated, while the perpetrators allegedly face zero consequences. It leaves us with this terrifying assertion from the source. When these communities operate without oversight, absolutely no one is protecting the vulnerable.
All right, Section 4, Evaluating the MAD Program. This is a harsh critique of state power. We are now zooming way out to the macro level to unpack the source's highly controversial, frankly explosive critique of Canada's legal and healthcare systems. The speaker connects that micro-level alienation we just talked about to the ultimate power of the state, presenting a really fierce critique of Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying program, commonly known as MAID. According to the speaker's data claims within the presentation, MAID has actually become the 5th leading cause of death for Canadians. The source uses this statistic to argue that the state's role in mortality is expanding at a really alarming rate.
Building on that, the speaker states directly in the material that, by their calculation, a fifth of deaths, that's 20%, are now executed by the state. To put that into perspective, that is a massive chunk of the mortality rate. We're presenting this statistic purely to visualize the source's claim, as it forms the very foundation of their argument that the country is being, in their words, smothered to death incredibly quickly.
This leads to probably the most intense parallel drawn in the entire material. The speaker argues that this normalization of state-assisted death actually mirrors the early stages of historical atrocities, specifically referencing the Holocaust. The source explicitly claims that historical horrors began with assisted suicide programs that normalized murder, before eventually expanding to other quote-unquote problems. They view MAID not as healthcare or patient autonomy, but as a systematic method to erase vulnerable, traumatized citizens, framing the whole thing as a profound ethical horror.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, State-Sanctioned Erasure, the Macro Catastrophe.
This is really the theoretical climax of the source's presentation, where all these concepts, the modern outlaw, the avoidance of pain, and state-assisted death, just completely collide. The source places an immense, terrifying responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the legal and political establishment. Quoting the material directly regarding the legal profession, they say, "We're the force that decides whether people live or die. No other profession has that decision." The speaker argues that while doctors try to maintain life, the legal expression of the state ultimately holds the power of life and death over these alienated individuals. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact pipeline the source claims is actively occurring right now, systematically pushing vulnerable people toward death. They call this the architecture of erasure. Here's how they break it down. First, a vulnerable citizen is traumatized and alienated, turned into that modern outlaw. Second, the legal system completely removes their access to justice. Third, society looks away, protected by that ecosystem of avoidance. And finally, rather than offering any sort of systemic healing or true accountability, the state simply offers assisted death. Let's move to the next point and see how this builds. Ultimately, the source contrasts true societal accountability, which they define as healing a citizen through justice, robust legal protections, and recognizing profound bonds like marriage, with what they frankly describe as a death-worshipping culture. In their view, erasing a citizen via alienation and MAID is simply the state's way of permanently removing inconvenient trauma from sight, silencing the victims of systemic failure once and for all. We've covered a tremendously dark and complex perspective today, moving from a single man locked out by 200 lawyers all the way to a sweeping condemnation of state-sanctioned mortality. And it leaves us with this provocative final question drawn straight from the core of the text. Must society actually learn to witness pain before it can ever truly uncover the truth? It's a really heavy thought to leave you with, forcing us all to deeply consider the societal implications of looking away from systemic injustice. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.